We use sashing a lot in our quilts. It's the means of constructing our quilts whereby we put the blocks together, whether those blocks are simple squares or whether they're slightly more complex, as in a sampler quilt, for example. It sounds very straightforward, and so it is. However, if you have a piece of sashing that comes across, which is disjointed, as it were, separated, you do need to be really careful about this visual line here. And I want to show you just some of the examples of how you can use sashing, and also some of the tricks of getting it nicely visual, because the bigger this piece of sashing is, the more difficult that is sometimes for beginners. As I say, the sashing is used a lot. This is very straightforward squares in this little quilt, just 5-inch squares held together with sashing that's probably been cut 1.5 inches. This is a similar sort of thing, but the sashing forms a pattern in its own right. This one is very large squares with much bigger sashing. These are probably 2.5 inches cut, so they end up with 2 inches. And obviously this is now a 2-inch gap, and we have to make sure that this is nice and parallel, because the eye will spot it, I promise you. Even smaller sashing on this one that has Japanese windows. This is available for you to download for free if you're a member of the website. And again, we've got just the 9 blocks, 9 squares, which have this visual sashing here. And again, this you need to pay attention to here. But then on this quilt, the major sashing here that holds the blocks of kind of 9 patched together has got cornerstones. I think this is a better option for most people for the sashing, because it gives you seams that you can match, and I think certainly for a beginner that's true. Our sampler quilt that we did on the website, Your First Sampler Quilt, definitely had cornerstones, and I do like that option. A couple of examples here whereby the sashing actually gets a little bit more complex and becomes a feature in its own right, rather than just holding the blocks together. Very simple scrappy blocks with this nice star effect, and a similar star effect on this sashing too. This is a little fleecy quilt, but it's the star effect in the sashing. The big quilt behind me, the blue and white one, which is also a scrap quilt, has very complex sashing to it, but and looks as part of the pattern. It's part of the overall design, but is actually still sashing. If you look at it, it is built in rows, and it has sashing pieces. Coming back to the original concept of sashing, whereby the vertical sashing holds the blocks together, and they are separated then by one long piece of fabric. We need to make sure that they live opposite each other. So I've got one that's in construction, a similar one to this. What I've done is I've made my rows with my horizontal sashing. When you do the sashing, you measure what the sashing needs to be. If you're copying a pattern, if you're following a pattern, again, don't go with the pattern dimensions necessarily on the length here of your sashing. Measure your block. Your sashing needs to fit your block. So if this is meant to be 12.5, but yours is 12.25, the sashing needs to be 12.25. You can obviously do the same width as your pattern instructs you. If your blocks are slightly smaller than the pattern gives you, you will have to measure from edge to edge for the horizontal piece. I've cut all my horizontal pieces the same size. What I would do is I would pin it in the middle, I would pin it either end, and I would sew that on the bottom of all my rows. I've marked my row, that's row 1. This is row 2. This is row 3. You can see I've put the horizontal sashing on there, row 3. And I've got another row that I've still got to work on. But what I wanted to show you was how we're going to match up this one onto this one. if I lay that over the top, it hopefully won't be visually too difficult. So we're going to pop this on here. I'm going to fold this back so you can see what I'm doing. Somewhere or other I had a pen, it's on the floor. Now, with practice, you will be able to do this by eye. But to start with, I suggest that you could get your ruler and put a little mark. If you line your ruler up here, you'd end up with a little mark here and a little mark here, and you then put your seam allowance. For the purposes of the camera, I'm just going to fold this back so that you can see this lines up absolutely exactly here. And I would just drop this on top and pop some pins in. I would do exactly the same with this. Don't worry about this bit at the moment, you're worrying about this. So we're going to line this up here and we're going to drop it down and pop pins in. As I say, if you want to put your ruler on and make a mark, that would be absolutely fine. Make sure this is well pressed. Pop those on there. So having anchored this section and this section, you would then, I'm going to borrow a pin here. I'm assuming, pop that one there, pin here. You could then pin this section. You will be able to flip that open and have a look, and it should be absolutely in line with the one underneath. So when you come to sew it, it will be beautifully in line. And with that one's not quite right. I can see, oh, yes, it is now. There. So that's the way you need to match up those pieces. You're also then, with your pin, going to match up the raw edges and ease the distance in between. And that means that your vertical sashing will be absolutely spot on and above its friend, as it were, immediately above and below their friends, so that your quilt will look absolutely stunning.